will have the recordings available at the end of the conference for you all. So just so you know that right off. Excellent.
There you go.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And thank you all for coming back. I hope you all had a good lunch. Our next speaker is going to be Michael O'Donnell, and he's going to talk about New Mexico's economy and the current situation and forecasts. Michael O'Donnell has been our acting director since last December, and so we all want to thank him for doing double duty, not only doing the quarterly forecast, but also being our director and trying to keep all of us who've been working from home and panicking during a pandemic from being calm and collected and moving forward and getting our job done. He's also been in charge of doing several different research projects this past year, and he specializes in, obviously, the forecast program, but also in policy analysis, regulatory analysis, demographic housing policy, and revenue forecasting. He also conducts water policy research and natural resource analysis. And has produced several articles, scholarly journals, and authored some chapters in books. So I give to you for the next hour plus, Michael O'Donnell. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Susan. And thanks everybody for being here. I appreciate it. Hopefully the presentation today will be not too depressing, given the current state of affairs. But in any event, I'll go ahead and get started. So today, I'm going to talk about the state economy. But before I start talking about the state economy, as I'll mention in a minute, I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. economy. I wouldn't normally do or spend as much time on this as I'm going to this time, but I think that there's a few things in terms of kind of national policy and national economics that are affecting or have the potential to affect the state economy more so than normal. We already kind of expect that to be the case, but there's a few sort of uncertainties in the economy that we are kind of watching out for and looking at. So very quickly, kind of a recap of what's been going on in the U.S. economy. So the U.S. economy is still about 4.2 million jobs below where we were pre-COVID. And so we go back to kind of February or so of 2020, after the loss of 20 plus million jobs in March and April of last year. The U.S. economy has kind of continuously or generally added jobs over the course of the next 18, 19 months, but we're still about 4.2 million jobs below where we were prior to COVID. And the rate of job addition, and I'll show this in a slide in a bit, the rate of job addition nationwide has kind of slowed over the last sort of 6 months or so. Initial and continuing claims for unemployment are falling, and the unemployment rate is 4.6%. So relatively low unemployment rate, nowhere near as low as it was prior to COVID, but still a lot better than where we were back in April of last year, when we were seeing the unemployment rate somewhere around 14% or so. Real GDP. So I'll show a slide on this in a minute. The third quarter, which is the most recent quarter, came in weak. So the rate at which, or the pace of the economy, has slowed over the last couple of months. There is, I would say, however, some upside there. The most recent estimates for just monthly estimates for October seem to suggest that consumer spending has accelerated, which is a good sign and kind of good for the overall trajectory of the economy. West Texas Intermediate, which is critical to the state, had firmed to about $85 a barrel. I checked it a little while ago. It's down to about $70 a barrel, which is quite a bit up from where it was last year, but obviously quite a bit below $85 a barrel that we saw kind of at the beginning of this month. Consumer Sentiment Index, it reached a kind of relative peak in June of 85.5. This is from the University of Michigan, but it fell to 71.7 in October, and it's down about 14% from the same month a year ago. So consumer sentiment has softened after peaking kind of this relative peak in the middle of the year. So as you can imagine, the Delta variant started impacting the economy and consumer behavior in the middle of the year. And as inflationary pressures start to rear their head sort of mid-year and through the most recent month, consumer sentiment has declined. It's not unexpected. The stock market has tapered the past few weeks after hitting highs basically a month or so ago. Manufacturing and non-manufacturing industries continue to expand. So basically, the kind of business production on that level seems to continue to be coming back from these kind of the doldrums post-COVID. And then I have some concerns, and this is the main reason I wanted to kind of talk about the U.S. economy, was mostly the concerns, because you can imagine many of these things have the possibility of affecting the state economy. So, of course, COVID is still a concern. It seems kind of crazy to think that going back, 20 or so months ago when COVID started, many of us thought, at least initially, that it was going to be a relatively quick thing, that we were going to get over it, reach herd immunity or whatever, relatively quickly, and that people were going to go back to more or less the lives that we had prior to COVID. That obviously has not yet happened. As we've seen, there have been multiple waves, potential for continued and additional waves. And so this is still an issue that we're contending with and the economy is contending with. Inflation is another issue that seemed basically since the Great Recession to not have to not be an issue for the U.S. economy, no matter what kind of policies were put in place by, for example, the Federal Reserve to essentially increase the money supply. We hadn't seen inflationary pressures. That changed at the beginning of this year, and we're seeing inflationary pressures essentially eating into incomes of households. We're also seeing supply chain disruptions, and we've seen this over the last couple of months in the news. Logistics concerns in terms of getting products to consumers, individual components or pieces of products that are required as inputs to produce things in short supply. So, for example, the one that I'm sure you've seen in the news, microchips, having basically constraining production for things like computers or cars and the like. Other things like oil being expensive, so the price of gasoline making transportation more expensive. And so those things affecting the overall trajectory of the economy. And of course, political challenges and pressures in terms of Congress being able to kind of get together and get things done, and then the president signing off on things as well. Many of these factors, of course, are interrelated. And I'm going to talk about each one of these, not completely in isolation, but I'm going to try to talk about each one of them sort of individually where I can. Okay, so concern, of course, COVID. An interesting thing that we have noticed since COVID is that there has been apparent behavioral changes. Households and consumers seem to, and by the way, so what I have on the slide here on the left-hand side, this is just something that I pulled from McKinsey & Company, a consulting firm that looked at what are the potential effects, or what things seem to have occurred since COVID started in terms of behavioral changes for consumers. And the things that I have circled on there, one of them is e-commerce. Thinking about the expansion of the set of people who are now shopping online compared to what we had prior to COVID. Whereas before, it was kind of below the 60-year age demographic, and I would argue even younger than that, who was purchasing a substantial amount of their goods online. That has expanded to a larger swath of the population where they have become much more comfortable, different age cohorts, older age cohorts, much more comfortable going online and shopping. And so that has the possibility of really shaking up local business. And for a state like New Mexico that, like many other states, but New Mexico that does have a relatively large retail sector, has a relatively large sector where people buy goods and services, or even come in from out of state, and while they're visiting, buy services in the local retail establishments. E-commerce has the possibility of shaking that up. And so I have that highlighted. The other thing too is this loyalty shakeup, which is really related to that. And that is, if people aren't getting or able to get their services or goods that they were purchasing them from before, they will go elsewhere. They will find things online. They will find other suppliers for goods that they can purchase from. Or if those suppliers, for whatever reason, don't align with their worldview, people are much more willing to switch brands or retailers to conform with their worldview. So just a couple of points there that seem to have kind of have trended this way prior to COVID, but it was punctuated and the trajectory has rapidly shifted after COVID and as people started changing their behaviors. The other thing is, and I have on the right part of the slide here, behavioral changes for workers. Another thing that we've seen after COVID has begun, and sort of as the quote recovery has started, is that the rate of job openings and the rate of quits have both increased. So I'm sure we've all seen in the news, there's more job openings than there's ever been, and there's more quits than there's ever been. Whereas there seem to have been over time, especially post-Great Recession, changes in the way that people were approaching their jobs, changes in the way that people would choose which places to work for, or the direction that they would go in terms of work. That has accelerated. And so I have this trend line that I just kind of eyeballed and drew in. That's kind of the hashed green line. And you see the trend has been generally for an increase for both of these things. There's a question about whether there's a skill or needs mismatch in terms of what skills workers have and what needs businesses have in terms of employing them. And maybe that's why there's this increase for both of them. But the fact is, we don't know whether it's a matter of skills and needs mismatch or whether it's a matter of just a change in the workforce in terms of how it views what it's doing and what it wants to do in the future. So I mentioned inflation is something that hasn't really been an issue for some time. That changed sometime around April of this year. On the right axis, you see basically inflationary pressures, the rate at which prices have increased for all items. On the left axis, it's all items less food and energy. The point here really is that, and the scales you see they're not exactly matched, they're a little bit different. So you see the all items that includes food and energy, the rate of the increase is faster because the price of especially energy has increased, but also food at a rate faster than the rest of the economy's prices have. But nonetheless, prices have increased. That's kind of the point. And so those price increases have for sure affected real wages to the extent that all prices in the economy, including wages, have increased. Real wages haven't kept up with those increases. So basically, the price of goods is starting to eat into any gains in wages that people are seeing, or at least on average, that is. And as I mentioned, supply chain disruptions. So per BLS, about 10 million unfilled job openings. Is there kind of a question is there a realignment of the labor market? There was a Washington Post headline from May suggesting that it's not a labor shortage, it's a reassessment of work in America. That is to say that the workers are reassessing what their place is in the economy and what jobs it is that they want to do. So there's been a narrative that people that worked in some of the service industries, so leisure and hospitality or retail trade, they took the opportunity during COVID to reassess what they wanted to be doing and make affirmative steps to not do those jobs anymore, and of course, do other jobs moving forward. And as I mentioned, input and component shortages, so things like the price of oil increasing or inputs like microchips and the like, affecting the cost of doing business, logistic issues. logistics issues, not enough workers in places in the locations where you need them to be in order to get things done. So there was a backlog of workers that were required to move product at certain ports. And so that was affecting, of course, what products were getting delivered in various places, or the speed at which things could get delivered. And then the last item that I want to mention here, just because I think it's a useful and interesting data source, Census Bureau's Small Business Pulse Survey. I have a link there for those of you who are interested in checking it out. A bunch of cool information, a bunch of cool stats, and they allow you to compare state to state in terms of small businesses and what kind of COVID, especially, and that was what I was interested in, maybe and the way in which COVID may be impacting those small businesses in different states. Okay, so real GDP growth. I'm not going to spend too much time here. Basically, the point is coming straight out of COVID in the third quarter of 2020, you see GDP expands at a pretty rapid pace, about 34%, to seasonally adjusted annual rate. And then you see it sort of average in the between 4.5 to 6.5 range for the next several quarters. And then it slows in the most recent quarter to a revised, this was just revised last week, 2.1%. This is a rapid slowdown compared to, or dramatic slowdown, I should say, compared to what we were seeing over the past year. But the good news is, as I mentioned, the initial data, at least that we have seen for October, suggests that especially consumer or consumption spending has accelerated or started to accelerate, suggesting that there's going to be a good holiday season this year, which should, you would imagine, push GDP up to reasonable levels in the fourth quarter. Of course, there's still the data for November isn't out yet. The kind of preliminary data for kind of the what analysts are expecting the fourth quarter to look like, not complete yet. But the suggestion is that we should be accelerating moving into the fourth quarter after a relatively weak third quarter. So this slide basically just shows the gains and losses that the economy sustained from 2010 through the most recent month that we had data for, which was October. You see that over that course of the period from 2010 through early 2020, you see there was a very small kind of shallow blue densities above the zero line. There was a very long period of over the month job gains, I think dating back to October of 2010. Every month from October 2010 through the beginning of the pandemic, the US economy added jobs. And you look at it in terms of the scales, it doesn't seem like a lot of jobs, but it was a substantial number of jobs over that period when you add all those areas together. To put that in perspective, at the beginning of the pandemic, that 2-month period in 2020 where we lost jobs, it wiped out all of those gains that we saw prior to the pandemic. And then you see those gains after the beginning of the pandemic. So starting, I believe it was in June or so, or May of 2020, you see the densities above the zero. And even with this sustained period of gains from that month through the most recent month, we're still about 4.2 million jobs below where we were prior to the pandemic. So we haven't recovered all of the jobs that we have lost. And in addition to that, if you look at the red line, that's kind of year over year growth. You see this kind of spike that we get in terms of, and so just to put it in perspective, the densities are month over the previous month. The percentages are year over year, so they don't line up exactly. But you see this spike after where it says 2021, and then you see the slowdown that we're getting. So the rate at which we're adding jobs is kind of slowing down on a year over year basis. As I mentioned, real wages have been eaten into as a result and part of inflationary pressures. Essentially, since April 2021, the rate of year over year real wage growth has been below zero. And so that's a function of a couple of factors. One of them is inflationary pressures. The other one is the economy is starting to add back somewhat lower waged workers now. who were the first workers that were kind of let go or left the labor force at the beginning of the pandemic. And so that's pulling average wage down as well. But inflation is also causing a role or playing a role there too. Okay, so I'm going to show this slide quickly. This is from a national forecasting service that we subscribe to, that is we being BBER, and their forecast informs our forecast for the state economy in terms of the trajectories of the various industries that we're looking at. The reason why I'm showing this slide is because I just wanted to point out in terms of their assessment of the US economy, when it is that they expect for certain industries to recover the jobs that were lost in 2020. So what showed on the slide, if you look from construction down to government, these are year over year either gains or losses in terms of hundreds of thousands of jobs for the US economy. The black numbers are gains, the red numbers are losses, the red numbers in parentheses, they're losses. So compared to the previous year, how many jobs have been gained or lost? As I'm sure you would suspect, in all of these industries listed, jobs were lost in 2020. So construction, manufacturing, trade, transportation, utilities, all of them. In the year, about nearly 8.7 million jobs were lost, and the number of jobs contracted by about 5.7%. The green circles that I have on the slide are according to the year in which that industry will recover all of the jobs that had been lost in 2020. So you actually see a good number of industries that are projected to gain back the jobs that had been lost. So professional and business services, so that includes things like attorneys, architects, engineers. That industry is expected to gain back the jobs that had been lost by 2020. The good news is for New Mexico, prior to there's two periods prior to the Great Recession, so going back to 2005, 6, early 2007, that was an industry, and even historically prior to that, that was an industry in New Mexico that had done particularly well. However, after the Great Recession in New Mexico, that was an industry that had sort of stagnated until the last about 4 or so years, and had kind of picked up the pace, and had been one of the key industries in the state over the last couple of years. The fact that this forecasting service that we think does a good job at projecting the U.S. economy believes that this industry will do well is actually, I think, good news for the state of New Mexico in terms of that being something that can pull the state forward. Other industries in 2020 expected to recover the jobs that had been lost. Healthcare and social assistance, a very large sector in terms of the number of individuals working in that industry. And other private, which is kind of a catch-all for everything else not listed. In 2023, construction, leisure and hospitality, which includes eating and drinking establishments and hotels and the like, that industry is expected to recover the jobs that have been lost. And again, this is nationally. New Mexico will have idiosyncrasies, and government will add jobs or recover the jobs that have been lost. You'll notice that for the US economy, the projection is that by 2022, the US will recover the jobs more than it had been lost in 2020. And so kind of 2022 will be back to or above the levels of jobs that we were at in 2019. When we get to New Mexico here in just a minute or two, we'll see that our projection for the state isn't quite as rosy, and that it will take a bit longer for us to get back to pre-COVID levels. The other thing I'll point out too, and I may as well just do it here because it's as good a time as any, is that I actually went back and looked, because I gave this presentation last year as well for those of you who attended, and our expectation in terms of timing isn't substantially different from what we expected last year. The pattern of growth is a little bit different, but the timing in terms of getting back to pre-COVID levels won't be substantially different. Okay, so on to the New Mexico review. So some
Before
data.
you go on, Mo,
Sure.
We had a question from Michael at NMDOT. What are the IHS assumptions regarding COVID for these forecasts?
I don't have that in this presentation, but I can definitely get them to him if he's interested. I can't recall exactly what they are. I think that in general, I don't remember the exact specifics, but I think that it's basically things taper off. Generally, we get kind of to more normal rates of consumer behavior as people, the vaccinations still continue to kind of increase, and basically it's kind of the delta variant sort of tapers off, and there isn't really any substantial increases in the number of cases or hospitalizations, and things are sort of under control. That's kind of the assumption. What I'll say about that is that you look at the data and you look at the states and you see what's going on in some states, and there has been increases in the numbers of people that are contracting COVID, and the numbers and pressures of hospitalizations in some of the states. And so I think that they sort of expect that there would be certain pockets, that there would be these upticks. But in general, I think that their expectation is for a generally smooth downward trend in the number of cases and the effect that it would have on the economy. I know that what they're expecting in addition to that, though, is that there will be these kind of fundamental changes in terms, like I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, in the orientation of the economy, in terms of the way that workers approach the economy, in terms of the jobs that people take, in terms of the services that people demand. And all of that stuff is really difficult to capture. But I think that it's generally for kind of a somewhat smooth landing. But if he wants the specifics, I can for sure provide them.
He was happy with in general. We had a second question come in from Francine Pacheco. It's great to hear there will be an increase in jobs in 2022. Do we also see data that shows wages will be increasing as well? As mentioned earlier, many service industries workers left to reevaluate with the assumptions wages were the cause. So curious if we will see the number of jobs increasing coinciding with the wage increase.
Yeah, so I think that the expectation in general is that wages will increase. The problem is, will wages increase at a rate that's commensurate with inflation? And that's a little bit harder to ascertain. I can tell you that from their projections and from other analysts that I've seen, there's going to be inflationary pressures, kind of overall economy-wide inflationary pressures for the next year or so, that probably will eat into wages somewhat, which will make it more difficult, I think, for people to decide to work in somewhat relatively lower wage industries where their dollar isn't going to go as far as it may have gone a couple of years back when those inflationary pressures weren't as acute. The difficulty is one of the factors that people put forward with regard to trying to explain why people weren't going back to work was, well, it just wasn't worth their while in terms of what the wages were. They could stay home. They could, they may have to pay for childcare. They may have other exigencies in their lives, and it doesn't make sense for them to go back and to work for $11 an hour, $10, and whatever the price may be. And so I think that the answer is yes, wages will go up, and our projection for the state is such that private wage and salaries will increase. But the X factor a little bit is how will that relate to inflation? And that over the next year or so is going to be a battle back and forth, I think.
That's it for the questions.
Okay, cool. So next on to the New Mexico review. So just quickly some historical data for the state, and before I get into the forecasts portion. So one of the things that we've observed since the beginning of COVID, really not since the beginning of COVID, since the beginning of the vaccination push, is that New Mexico has performed relatively well in terms of the number, or I should say the percentage of eligible folks that have been vaccinated in the state. The difficulty, or kind of the problem in quotes, is that over the last 3 or 4 months, any advantage that the state has had has kind of been lost. And the percentage of people, if you compare New Mexico versus other states that are vaccinated who are eligible for being vaccinated, New Mexico's ranking has slipped a bit. And so I'll show something that I poached from the New York Times, actually, because they publish this sort of on a regular basis, how the states compare. So that's kind of one kind of issue, I suppose. Unemployment insurance claims nationally have been falling. That's also true statewide. As you can imagine, some of this has to do with the recent expiration of the federal unemployment benefits that had been provided. But claims had been falling even prior to that. They just fell much more quickly after the expiration started to occur. But New Mexico is still generally performing worse than most states. I'll show you slides on these in a bit. So the data that we use to inform our actual forecast for the economy is from the quarterly census of employment and wages. So this is an actual count of jobs as reported by employers. And because it's a count as opposed to a survey, there's a bit of a delay. The most recent data that we have is from the first quarter of 2021. There is, as of a couple days ago, some data for the second quarter of 2021, but it's just totals. And so those totals aren't yet incorporated into our forecast, but I'll point that out in a little bit when I get to the slide that shows you what the rates of growth look like. And perhaps there's a little bit of good news in here as well that I can share when we get there. We also, of course, supplement our forecast with more up-to-date employment data, and specifically we use the CES series from BLS, which is a household survey based on the household surveys that provide us employment estimates as well. And we use those to provide us some framework for trying to understand what the gap is between what the QCW data say and what our kind of projections look like going forward. So with that said, looking back at the beginning of kind of the decline in jobs in the second quarter from COVID, the sort of leisure and hospitality industries, the kind of so-called leisure and hospitality industries, and also kind of lumping in other services, which is kind of a catch-all that includes a lot of things that you might associate with leisure and hospitality. Those industries lost about 40,000 jobs. They contracted by about a third, which is pretty huge in terms of a contraction. Retail and wholesale trade lost about 10,000 jobs, nearly 10% contraction. Local government lost about 7,000 jobs, down about 7%. I'm pointing out local government here, and I'll explain why in a minute. We look at the most recent data, which is that we have the sectoral data from QCW. So the first quarter of 2021, leisure and hospitality, now it's down 28,000 jobs, down about 24%. So in other words, it's no longer down 40,000. Some of the jobs that had been lost have been recovered, apparently. And so I would suggest that even though those jobs are still below where we were prior to the pandemic, the number of jobs in that industry, any recovery is kind of, relatively good news. Retail and wholesale trade kind of combined, now it's only down about 3,000 jobs. Again, a bit of a recovery. And actually, if you look at the data on a kind of quarter-over-quarter, year-over-year basis, going back, looking at the third quarter of 2020, fourth quarter of 2020, and the like, this industry actually bounced back relatively quickly. As well, we'll see in a bit here when we show the forecast, some of this improvement in this particular industry, we're expecting to be somewhat short-lived, especially as many folks have transitioned almost entirely to shopping online, and as we expect that trend to continue going forward. Local government, now that industry is down 13,000 jobs. down about 13%. The reason why I'm pointing out local government is not just because this is one of the industries that is doing actually worse now than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. Some of that might be expected. The government industries, perhaps there's at least some immediate counter-cyclical type things going on that would buffer it from the kind of negative effects of economic contraction. But I also want to point this industry out because this industry includes things like public school teachers. It includes municipal and government workers, local government workers, that is. So people that work for the counties or people that work for cities, municipalities, and the like. But it also includes tribal workers. And so many of the casinos and tribal operations were pretty much shut down and continued to stay shut down until mid-2021. And you can see this coincide with some of the net win data that we see from the casinos, and that is to say that as a measure of overall activity at those specific tribal businesses, they were essentially shut down. And so as a result of COVID. And so we are kind of in a hole as far as that's concerned, a deeper hole than we were a year ago. Hopefully some of that will be filled in going forward. Another thing to point out, oil continues to firm in terms of production, and that's good news for state budgets. There was a recent article in the paper in I think the Albuquerque Journal recently that talked about how, because of, in part anyway, firm oil prices and high production, state budgets might be looking at net additional new money that might not have otherwise been expected. And so in terms of, from a fiscal perspective, that's a good thing. Okay, so as I mentioned, and this is a slide that I've shown to pretty much over the last year, every time that I've presented some type of forecast, and that is, how does New Mexico compare to other states in terms of the percentage of the population that's been vaccinated? And straight out of the gate in 2021, the beginning of the year, New Mexico was one of the highest vaccination states in terms of getting 1 shot or 2 shots. Obviously, we're looking at relatively low numbers. We're looking at relatively small populations of people that were eligible for the shot. But nonetheless, New Mexico was kind of exceeding expectations as far as that's concerned. If we move forward to November of this year, many states and areas have surpassed New Mexico in terms of folks being vaccinated, both in terms of 1 shot and fully vaccinated. I don't know that it's necessarily a problem, but I just wanted to point out, and I've kind of been wanting to point out, that any advantage that, or perceived advantage that the state may have had in terms of it being a state that would be, relatively safe in terms of getting back to business because vaccination rates were high, the state is kind of falling behind other places now. Okay, so moving on to unemployment insurance claims by state, comparing New Mexico to a bunch of other places. This slide's actually a little bit difficult to, I think, to kind of get your head around, I think. So let me just go ahead and sort of explain what each one of these columns mean in the graphic on the right. So the first column, at the peak, in terms of the number of the percentage of people claiming for or claiming unemployment or basically filing for unemployment, how does New Mexico compare to other states? So compared to the number or the percentage, compared to the number of people who were working, New Mexico had 12.7% of the workforce file for unemployment. That's right in the middle compared to the other states. New Mexico ranked 23rd. Put differently, in terms of original filing for unemployment, New Mexico was about average. Kind of just was about like every other state. The next column looks at now compared to where we were pre-pandemic. do we have a higher percent or lower percent of people that are still on unemployment insurance? And New Mexico, because it has a positive percentage and a green bar, suggests that we still have a higher percent of people on unemployment compared to prior to the pandemic. 37 states are doing better than New Mexico. So New Mexico is kind of falling behind other places. I won't spend any time on the third column. It's basically some measure of unemployment. I think the better measure of unemployment is the actual official unemployment rate. And this is through, actually, I believe it's through October. And that is the state's unemployment rate was 6.5%. That puts it 47th in the country. Only New Jersey, New York, California, and Nevada have higher unemployment rates than New Mexico. And the other thing I want to point out as well is that the labor force participation rate in New Mexico is very low. It's 57.1%. Only West Virginia and Mississippi have lower labor force participation rates. The U.S. rate is about 61.6%. So the takeaway here, I think, is we have a relatively low percentage of the population that's actually participating in the labor force. And of those people that are participating in the labor force, we have a high percent of the population, of that population, that's unemployed. And so that's kind of a recipe for maybe the economy isn't firing as well in New Mexico as it might otherwise fire in other places. So the last slide showed kind of standard unemployment claims. So those would be just the regular run-of-the-mill unemployment filings and claims that we might typically see. This slide actually includes all of the other unemployment benefits, the extended unemployment benefits, the unemployment benefits that were provided for the proprietors that prior to the pandemic weren't provided, and the like. So the whole kind of range of unemployment benefits as we came to know them during COVID. The line is sort of what I'm going to focus on here, and that's continuing claims. That's a reference to the left axis. That hit a peak sometime around July of 2020 of about 186,000 continuing claims for unemployment, which is a pretty staggering number when you look at the population of New Mexico being somewhere around, if you include everybody in New Mexico, something around 2 to 2.1 million people, 186,000 people continuing to claim unemployment benefits. That's a pretty staggering number. We did, however, see general decline over the period from mid last year to around August or September of this year. And then you see this rapid decline when the expiration of many of these federal programs began. And so now we're sitting, and this data hasn't been updated in the last week or two, but the trends are pretty much similar. So something around 19 or so thousand continuing claims, down from prior to the expiration of the benefits, around 85,000 or so claims. One thing I'll point out here is that, and we saw this in the news several months back, and the claim was that one of the factors that was preventing or disincentivizing people from returning to work, because we've seen there's labor shortages. I talked about this in the US section as that being a difficulty for the economy, sort of labor shortage, is that these unemployment benefits were providing a sufficient disincentive for people to return to the labor force. One of the things that states who kind of quit these federal extended benefits and federal additional benefits prior to the federal expiration, the thought was that those individuals would quickly return to the labor force. They would take work as they could find it, and the labor shortage would thus be solved. What those states did not experience was a solving of their labor shortage. And so that may be as a result of other factors at play, things like stimulus payments, other benefits that people were receiving, or even things like the moratorium on evictions and the like. It'll be interesting to see if there is a substantial and sufficient response to people returning to the labor force after essentially the federal government sort of cut the tap off. And it's too early to know whether that will be the case in New Mexico or elsewhere. But the early kind of experiences of many of those other states were that there wasn't substantial increase commensurate with what they would have expected for people to return back to the labor force after those programs ended in those particular places.
Before you go on, just
sure.
a quick question in chat for you, Mo. How much of the employment decline in these industries in New Mexico, including local government, is due to continuing early retirements?
So I think that actually has something to do with it as well. What you'll notice if you look at the data for New Mexico is a relatively old state in terms of the population. If you look at the age cohorts in the state, New Mexico has a high percentage of people that are relatively older. You look at the median age of the state is higher than many other states in the country. People are at a higher likelihood of being retirement age. I suspect, and this is actually something that we saw to some degree, not just in New Mexico, but around the country after the Great Recession, was that people kind of took stock, I think, of what the workforce was going to look like and made a decision. Maybe it doesn't make sense to go back to work. Maybe it makes sense to just retire. I think that's playing a role there as well. So yeah, I think that has something to do with it too, for sure. Yeah, it's the demographics in the state. But that said, New Mexico is not the only state that's facing these labor shortage issues. I think in terms of it being a more long-lasting, substantial problem in New Mexico, potentially, that's something to kind of, I think, look out for moving forward. So this slide shows year-over-year change in terms of numbers of persons in the New Mexico labor force by place. I have it defined by the various metropolitan areas, so Albuquerque, Las Cruces, Santa Fe, Farmington, and also geography that we like to lump together, Lee and Eddy County. I pull that out and show that because that's where a lot of the oil production takes place. That's where a good amount of the variability in terms of really population movements happen, is Lee and Eddy County. And so it's an important geography to kind of isolate. And then the rest of New Mexico, which is a pretty large area because it's literally everything else. So basically what we've seen, if we go back and look at the beginning of the pandemic, you see all of these geographies losing labor force, unexpected. You see move forward about a year, continued loss in the labor force, and then year-over-year increases beginning sort of around March of 2021. And then you see in the most recent data, some decline in the labor force. These data are revised, they're remodeled and adjusted as better information comes to light. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of this gets revised a little bit. I think for me, the important takeaway for this slide is, of course, we lost a lot of labor force during the pandemic. We continued to lose some basically as the vaccinations began to happen and as the economy was just starting to kind of get back on its feet. And then we're starting to see, beginning kind of in the first quarter of 2021, gains in terms of the labor force. One slide that I actually don't have here is, I was kind of curious in terms of how we looked compared to in 2021, if you compare it to 2019, and we're still running well below in all geographies labor force levels that we had prior to the pandemic, which is probably not surprising. And so labor force obviously not back to where it was prior to the pandemic in any location in the state. Okay, so in this messy graph, what we have is the other employment data series that I was talking about, the CES, also produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Survey-based data, these data are revised and actually benchmarked back to the QCW data when those data become available, and they do this benchmarking process once a year. The magenta line is going to be New Mexico. The kind of gray lines are all the other states in the country. And what I've done is I've indexed back for each state the employment levels in March 2020. And so you can see what percent of the number of jobs in each state have been recovered compared to sort of right before the pandemic hit in terms of the number of jobs that had been lost. You see this rapid decline in April for all the places, all the way down to, in some states, only being around 77% or so the number of jobs that were there in that particular location a month prior. Some places didn't get hit nearly as bad, 93, 94% of the jobs a month prior. New Mexico is one of the states that actually got hit not nearly as bad as any other place in the state or in the country. This actually mirrors, if you go back to the data that we have to the Great Recession, and I am bringing the Great Recession up here a lot for a specific reason, and that is what we saw after the Great Recession was that New Mexico actually was somewhat insulated compared to many of the other states. We weren't hit nearly as hard as other places. We didn't drop as far as most other states, but after the initial impact, the state moved sideways. And in fact, it took nearly a decade for the state to recover the jobs that had been lost at the beginning of the Great Recession. What's concerning for New Mexico when I look at this graph is that New Mexico wasn't hit nearly as bad as other places. You see the magenta line not going down as far as many other states, somewhere about average, maybe a little bit above average in terms of its performance. But then you see it kind of stagnate. It has moved up a little bit, and that's better than what we saw during the Great Recession. But now it's lagging most of the other states in the country. In fact, 44 other states have recovered a greater share of jobs than New Mexico. 6 states have recovered essentially all the jobs that have been lost, 99% or better. The only states or places that are worse than New Mexico in terms of the percent of jobs that have been recovered are Alaska, DC, and Hawaii, Louisiana, and New York. A few states have actually recovered all of the jobs that had been lost at the beginning of the pandemic. One thing I'll point out here is that the newest data that we have shows a little bit of an improvement in terms of where New Mexico is at relative to what I have up here, but it still has New Mexico somewhere in the 40s in terms of its place relative to the other states. So New Mexico is sort of failing to take advantage of some of the opportunities that maybe some of the other states are availing themselves of. Okay, so switching gears here a little bit, oil production and oil is an important part of the state economy, not just in terms of the number of people that are employed directly in this industry, because as it turns out, there's not that many individuals that work in sort of the mining industry doing mining operations for oil, something like, between 15 and 20,000 people. However, the pay in the industry is relatively high, and it also greatly affects the local economies in the areas in which the mining activity takes place. And even more broadly than that, it directly affects the state budget in a very substantial way. And depending on how you measure what's affecting the state economy or the state budget, oil production has the role of effectively influencing something on the order of around a third of what the state budget is. And so that affects, of course, the activities that the state can embark on, the various things that the state can pay for. It affects things like raises for state employees or the number of people that can be hired by the state to do work. And so it's pretty important. In any event, Currently, as of the most recent data I've seen, there's about 85 drilling rigs operating in New Mexico. What's interesting is that about 17% of all U.S. rigs or drilling rigs that are operating in the United States are operating in New Mexico. If we go back to early 2016, New Mexico was only at about 4% of the U.S. total. And so New Mexico has increased in importance dramatically in 5 years. New Mexico is one of the most productive places to produce. And you can see that the interest in New Mexico for production has increased substantially. In addition to that, about 12% of all U.S. field oil production occurs in New Mexico, also up from about 4% in 2016. So a lot of drilling occurring in New Mexico and a lot of production in New Mexico. I have some other data here as well for those that are interested. And you can see how New Mexico's increase in field production compares to the U.S. One point to make, New Mexico accounts for about 5% of U.S. gas production by volume. So really the name of the game in New Mexico is oil production. One thing that we've noticed in the data is that there seems to be a move towards more efficient production. And by efficient here, I mean we can produce more oil with fewer workers. New Mexico mining jobs averaged about 20,000 in 2016, peaked about 26,000 in 2019. And then, of course, COVID hit in 2020. And so now it's sitting around 18,000 as of September 2021. There's still obviously reasonable labor demands for drilling, but production itself is deviating. So if you look on the red line, and I'm looking on the right side, the right axis, this is the number of jobs per drilling rig. The number of the number of jobs per drilling rig, that's the blue line, reference to the right axis. The number of people that are required to drill is declining compared to where we were if we go back to 2016. You see that trend, that downward trend. The production per job, which is the red line reference to the left axis, you see the amount of oil that's being produced per number of people working in the industry. You see the number of barrels increasing. So they need fewer people working in the industry to produce more oil. So kind of more efficient production. A comparison versus other states. New Mexico and all of these is kind of in red on this particular slide. On the left-hand side, this is oil production. And really the point here is you see starting in 2017, New Mexico, in terms of the number of barrels produced compared to some of the other states that it produced similar volumes to, so Colorado, Oklahoma, and Wyoming, New Mexico has far outstripped those other states. It's nowhere near what Texas is producing. Texas has a larger area to produce in, but it is dominating these other states in terms of importance. And in fact, you can see these other states, especially Oklahoma and Colorado, starting in mid 2019, the number of barrels that they're producing is declining when the number of barrels that New Mexico is producing is increasing and increasing rapidly. And although, if you go to the right panel up there, although really oil is the name of the game for New Mexico, you see that natural gas has increased sort of as a byproduct of oil production in the state, mostly. Although there are kind of dedicated oil production activities in the state, a lot of the increase that we're seeing here has to do with secondary production from this oil production. Also, if you look at what kind of gross state products look like in the various states, if you just look at what mining is, and mining here, of course, will include all of the mining activities in those particular states. So, for example, Wyoming, they produce a lot of coal, and so that would mostly be coal activity. But in any event, you just look at mining just broadly. You look at New Mexico's private sector gross state product, about 20% of New Mexico's gross state product, just in private industries, is directly resulting from oil production, or mining, I should say, generically.
Quick question before you switch gears. Do we have a sense of why efficiency in terms of production is so high compared to other states?
I think that it has to do with the geologic makeup in that section of the Permian Basin. And I'm not a geologist, so I don't know the exact details, but my understanding is that it's just a really effective place. It is a financially very good place for producers to produce using the technology that's currently available. If you go back and look at the data in terms of the mining technologies being used, historically, the type of technology that was used was something called vertical drilling, these straight down drills that were used. They'd suck up oil almost from a vertical straw, and then they go to a different place, punch another hole, and suck up from this vertical straw. Now, almost all of the activity that's new activity anyway that's being done is horizontal drilling, where they're using a lot of fracking, and the type of geologic structures in the New Mexico section of the Permian Basin that this is occurring in is particularly productive for that type of technology. So we are the kind of beneficiary of the type of technology that just happens to be the one that's being largely used right now. So switching gears here to housing, another item that's been in the news pretty frequently is both housing sales, and these are for existing houses, housing sales and housing price. This is data from the New Mexico Realtors Association. This is actually publicly available. You can go to their website and pull it. I have categorized the places by metropolitan area and sort of the rest of state. You can see that comparing 2020 and 2021, and this is January to August, so those sort of 8-month-long period, kind of comparing the year in 2020 versus those months 2020 versus 2021, you see that in virtually every place the number of sales has increased, and also on top of that, the median price has increased in virtually every place as well. There's a couple of exceptions there, but in general, that's been the trend. The rate of sales, if you actually look on a month-over-month basis, has sort of slowed a bit, but we're still above where we were a year prior. Year-to-date sales are up about 7% statewide. I think when I did this a few months ago and looked at the data, I think sales were up over that 6 or so month long period compared to a year prior, about 10% or so. So that rate has slowed a bit, but nonetheless, sales are still up. And I don't have data on inventories, but the suggestion is that inventories are still somewhat low. And in fact, if you actually go to some of the housing sites like Zillow or Realtor.com, and you click on houses, you will see pending, 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 pending. So many of the houses are going up and selling very quickly. So I don't have those statistics here, kind of days on market or anything like that. But the suggestion is that demand is sort of outstripping supply, and that's continuing to be the case. And of course, that's having the effect of pushing up prices. And even as determined by median price, that's up 16% from a year ago. So the median sales price of a house in New Mexico, $270,000, which to me is pretty astounding given that New Mexico is a relatively poor state as compared to other places. You look at the various geographic areas and you look at Santa Fe, and of course we know Santa Fe can be a relatively expensive place in terms of housing. That metropolitan area, median price, almost $500,000, which is pretty mind-blowing to me. So a slide showing taxable gross receipts by county, basically just showing, and this is the second quarter of 2021 over the second quarter of 2020. You can see which areas are doing relatively better this year than last year. I don't know that there's tons and tons to show here. Some of this, obviously, especially the left-hand side that shows in millions of dollars, some of the larger areas are dominating. So like Bernalillo County, just a large area in terms of population. You'd imagine gross receipts would be high there. But even in terms of percentage terms, up about 14%. It's not surprising that in general there has been increases. 2020 quarter two, that's really the beginning of the pandemic. And so we're comparing kind of this recovery in 2021 quarter two compared to these really sharp declines in the second quarter of 2020. In aggregate, taxable gross receipts are up about $1 billion compared to a year earlier, and that's just for that quarter that we're looking at. We look at the various industries, the industries that were hit particularly hard in the second quarter and also relatively large and have a lot of the activity. Unsurprising, kind of at the top, retail, trade, accommodation, and food services, healthcare, as a lot of establishments were kind of shuttered for some of the kind of non-immediately necessary activities and operations, so dental offices and some of the activities in doctors' offices that didn't have to get taken care of right away. As some of that has opened back up again, unsurprising that we're seeing gains, other services, utilities, et cetera. In general, here, of course, this is $1 billion as well because it's matched to the other slide that I just showed you, but just broken out by industry. In general, we're seeing gains in most industries. I won't spend much time on this, but this is state recurring revenue. The most recent data that we have is through May 2021. These data, again, like many of the other sources that I'm showing you, publicly available. They're on the LFC's website. They have the hyperlink down there for you. And it just shows basically fiscal year through May of 2021. So July of 2020 through May of 2021, what the various kind of accounts are, state budget accounts, what that looks like comparing to the year prior. So GRT down pretty substantially, pretty unsurprising, although the suggestion is the more recent data is that we're seeing improvement there. Things like personal income tax and corporate income tax and mineral production tax, those things above zero, basically we're seeing gains that are sort of compared to a year prior. If you sum everything together, comparing 2021 from July through May to a year prior, essentially the state budget kind of flat. So no real gains there, no substantial losses in aggregate. So my kind of last lead-in slide before I talk about our forecast is basically a slide that shows sort of one-year estimates for state-to-state migration. The reason why I'm showing this is because what we've seen over the last several years is that New Mexico has been sort of stagnating in terms of population. We've seen a lot of individuals that are, especially the data suggests, especially in the kind of prime working age years. So college graduates, somewhere between, early 20s and kind of, mid to late 30s, leaving to find other opportunities in other states. And the individuals that we have coming into the state, such that we have them, tend to be somewhat less educated and somewhat older than the population that we're losing. This just shows 1 year. So this is from the December 2020 census estimates. Total in-migration for the year, about 56,000, but out-migration about 73,000. So there's a net loss of about 17,000 people. You can see that Texas is the big state in terms of in and out migration. That's really kind of unsurprising. As I mentioned, Lee and Eddy County, which is those counties tend to be the places that produce a substantial percent of oil that's produced in the state. You have a good number of individuals in those counties that go back and forth between New Mexico and Texas, actually between New Mexico and some of the other surrounding states too. They could be going to Oklahoma, even in times when oil is really booming, to places like North Dakota and the like, but more recently going to places like Texas to find other opportunities. Arizona and Nevada, New Mexico has lost the greatest other than Texas in terms of out migration states. And California and Colorado, New Mexico has actually gained some population in the year from those states. I would say that year-to-year variation in this is probably not that big of a deal. But the concern for a state like New Mexico is when there's a trend of continued, bleeding of individuals to other states and losing your population base, that is potentially an issue. And that's sort of what we've seen post-Great Recession, sort of in general. Okay, so New Mexico outlook. So this is moving on to our forecast for the economy. So just some text here. Our forecast is generally dependent on business and behavioral responses in New Mexico. I've done a similar presentation to this particular presentation for a while now, and this has been the case for basically since COVID started. How are businesses going to react? How are consumers going to react to this new economy that we have? To the idea that, we may be a little bit more conservative with regard to what we go out and do and the choices that we make compared to what we were doing prior to COVID. Our expectation is that there will be a slow recovery in New Mexico, and this will be slow relative to the US, and that if you want to kind of give it a shape, that we'll have kind of a U-shaped recovery or this attenuated swoosh. By swoosh, I mean almost a Nike swoosh type recovery. And I'm not the one who coined that term. That's something that's been around since COVID happened. What's the shape of the recovery going to be like? Is it going to be a U shape? Is it going to be a V shape? It's going to be a swoosh. Is it going to be an L? And so our expectation, the thing that we've so far seen, is that we're not having this V-shaped recovery that it sort of looks like the US economy had, depending on the particular variable that you're looking at, but that New Mexico will have a little bit more of an attenuated recovery. We also produce alternative scenarios to that that I'll get to when we get to that section. Okay, so going back to 2020 quarter two, the state lost something on the order of around 90,000 jobs. And it appears as though the state recovered about 13,000 jobs in the third quarter and about 15,000 jobs in the fourth quarter. For the year, the state was down. So for the average for the year, which includes a pretty good first quarter of 2020, the state was down about 55,000 jobs compared to 2019. Our expectation for this year, for 2021, is that the state will have expanded by about 0.4 of a point, which is not a lot, which is pretty slow. And you might argue it's generally sideways, but not negative. Before gaining steam in 2022, about 3%, which is quite robust rate of growth. Growth of about 1.6% is what we're projecting per year thereafter, which is a modest rate of growth for the state. Our expectation is that the economy will exceed 2019 levels of employment by about 900 jobs. If you remember when I talked about the US projections, the National Forecasting Service, their expectation is that the US will recover jobs back to 2019 levels in 2022. We're not expecting that for the state that quickly. We're going to be delayed by about 2 years. By 2026, we're expecting that employment will be some 24,000 jobs above 2019 levels. This is generally in line, and we produce these forecasts on a quarterly basis. It's generally in line with our July forecast. And if you actually go back and compare our forecasts that I presented last year, which only went to 2025, but if you compare our forecast through 2025 this time compared to a year ago, it's very similar in terms of where we end in 2025. And in fact, in terms of exceeding 2019 levels, we do that in 2024, I believe, in that forecast as well. So not terribly dissimilar in terms of our overall understanding or our projections for the economy. Income patterns, strong growth in 2020 and 2021, largely boosted by things like the unemployment benefits that people were receiving, the stimulus checks and the like. As many of those benefits are pulled back in 2022, there will be a contraction of incomes even though we will see gains of wage and salaries, these huge transfer payments that recipients in New Mexico received will pull the total down. And then thereafter, slowly accelerating and then reaching about 5% per year, which is a reasonable rate of not reasonable, it's very good actually, rate of income growth. The difficulties are that there are many headwinds potentially impacting the US economy that also come to play in New Mexico. The state's uniqueness, sort of in quotes, may operate as a hindrance or an asset. However, it seems like there's opportunities to be exploited. There are some industries that, even despite COVID, seem to have taken hold, or even prior to COVID, and continue to be expanding, or seem to be expanding, or at least not substantially contracting after COVID and during this recovery. There are some industries, so IT and just information in general, things like professional and technical services, so things like Sandia and Lannel, various business spinoffs from tech transfer from those places, from the universities and the like. Other industries such as bioscience and aerospace that have been targeted as industries that the state could have a sort of a comparative advantage in. Also, New Mexico is a hub for culture and recreation, outdoor recreation, historic preservation, arts and culture, and the like. And then New Mexico is a producer of things like oil and gas, or isn't a thought leader for things like, what do we do for in terms of cleaning nuclear cleaning nuclear sites and dealing with those areas, or green energy initiatives and those sorts of energy-related industries. Fully realizing the state's economic goals will likely require kind of a policy making that's more nimble than we've seen in the past, perhaps, robust stakeholder engagement, and a level of risk taking that I think that we've pulled back from since after the Great Recession. So people will have to be willing to take risks, and businesses, of course, will have to be willing to take risks, and those risks will have to be rewarded and fostered as well through policymaking. So in 2020, the industries that we saw contract, I have up there, and this is again according to the QCW data. And I didn't mention this before, the QCW data only includes people who are covered by unemployment insurance, which is important. It's an important distinction compared to sort of some other metrics for employment, which will include, for example, proprietors and other workers who clearly have an impact on the economy, a substantial and important impact in the economy, but just are not captured by this particular data set. So we can see the industries that contracted the most: accommodation, food services, mining, retail trade, and as I mentioned, local government, all contracting substantially in terms of numbers of jobs lost, and also in terms of percent of jobs in those particular industries lost. One thing I'll point out, arts and recreation, that's the second half of kind of the leisure and hospitality super sector. So that includes accommodation and food services and arts and recreation. That contracted 53%. So a huge contraction of the industry relative to the other industries. And that's one that's really struggling to get back to where it was, even more so than many of the other industries in the state. So the state, as I mentioned several slides back, lost about 89 to 90,000 jobs in the second quarter. If we just look at the first quarter data, the state, the first quarter of this year, which is the most recent data of QCW that we have, the state is still down some 71,000 jobs. And we can see by industry, and this is sorted kind of by which industries are still down year over year in the first quarter of 2021 compared to the first quarter of 2020. Accommodation is still down nearly 22,000 jobs. Government in aggregate down about 14,000 jobs. Mining about 7,000. Construction down about 4,300. Arts about 4,200 and the like. You can see the list as they get relatively less bad as you move up. I will be interested when the disaggregated data come out to see how this shakes out for the second quarter and whether there have been substantial improvements in the data. And I'm pointing that out as I move on to sort of my first forecast slide, because what I'm showing up here, this is our forecast for employment growth, and there's some history there going back to the beginning of 2017, and our forecast going through the end of 2026. And you see the 4 quarters at the beginning of the pandemic that are well below zero, down to about 11% or so at the beginning of the pandemic, and then still staying down 8% year over year through the first quarter of 2021. Our projection was for the second quarter to show year over year growth of about 4.6%. The aggregate data has since come out and suggests that it actually came in a little bit stronger than expected, about 5.5%. So I would say that that's actually a pretty positive sign. If anything, what we tend to do is we tend to be a little bit optimistic, just probably because we're so used to, well, not so used to anything. What we've seen is that historically, especially coming out of the Great Recession, is that we kind of expect that we will kind of recover relatively quickly. And so when I first started doing this, producing the forecast and working with my colleagues at BBER to do this, what we would do was we would produce our forecast, we would run our models, and our models would suggest that we would bounce back relatively quickly. And what we saw, the experience was, we didn't bounce back nearly as quickly as we expected, and the recovery kept getting pushed back further and further. And so what happened was our models were suggesting that we would have faster rates of growth than what actually ended up coming in. In this particular case, the model suggests that we had only 4.6% growth, and the fact that the data as it came in is nearly a percentage point faster than that, I think is probably a good sign. What I will say is I know that as the Delta variant really kicked in the third quarter, and as the US economy sort of slowed in the third quarter, that might weigh things down a little bit for New Mexico. So the trend that steps down a little bit after that initial uptick is probably generally consistent. The hope is, however, that we will be above what the projection is showing on the slide. Moving forward, slight improvement, almost hitting again 4% by the end of the year, beginning of next year, until we end up smoothing out to about 1.6% growth for the remainder of the forecast on average. Over the period from 2021 through 2026, what I'm showing up here is the aggregate number of jobs in each of these industries that we expect to be added. So the largest number of jobs are going to go to industries that either were the ones that had the greatest contractions as a result of COVID. So for example, accommodation and food services really hammered down a substantial number of jobs. Probably will add the greatest number of jobs back, about 14,000. But still, if you compare that to pre-COVID levels, in contrast to what the US projections are, we're not expecting that sector to recover all of the jobs that have been lost, even though that's a large number of jobs. Other industries such as healthcare and social assistance, which has the greatest number of jobs in the state in terms of the private sector, adding about 9,600 or so jobs over the period. But because it's so big, relatively modest rates of growth. Professional and technical services, following the trend of generally strong growth nationally, that is expected to translate well to New Mexico. Construction, adding jobs, administrative and waste services, mining, and the like. Local government, trying to backfill many of those jobs that have been lost. We don't expect that to recover all of the jobs that have been lost prior to the pandemic. Nonetheless, that's what we're expecting, about 7,000 jobs over the period.
Quick question, Mo.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick question, and this came in earlier. How will the infrastructure bill impact industries in New Mexico?
Yeah, so The infrastructure bill, the one that had been, the one that's been passed and signed, was incorporated into the national forecast. And so that was an assumption that went into, that was definitely an assumption that went into the construction of our, no pun intended, of our forecast. For sure, that will have a positive impact on the monies available to spend for construction activities and the like throughout the state, the rural areas, the metro areas. In terms of how that money will be actually allocated and spent, I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect that there will be a positive impact, as it will be sort of just money flowing into the state that will be spent for things that will be undertaken. The thing that is not included in this forecast is the Build Back Better bill that was passed in the House and is onto the Senate now, because it's not included in the national forecast, and it's unclear whether that will actually pass and actually end up being signed. And so it will have a positive impact. I don't know if I can exactly quantify it. I haven't studied it closely enough, but other than to say that it is included as an assumption in the underlying model. Okay, so moving on to personal income, you see these rapid increases in year-over-year personal income growth. As a result, much of this has to do with the stimulus payments. The state, or folks in the state, kind of paying back in a way over the next, or being paid back over the next several quarters as a result of these huge influx of transfer payments. I think probably this next slide is a little bit better in the sense that you can see where the money is coming from, where the income growth is coming from. So huge transfer payments, that's kind of the orangish brown bars. And this is increased compared to the prior year in 2020 and 2021. As that's pulled back in 2022, that's going to pull growth back. And then as things sort of start to get back to normal in 2023 and out, you start to see more regular rates of growth of about 4.5% to 5%. And then just to compare the various regions of the state, and I won't spend too much time with this here, but the various areas of the state will recover at different rates. We're expecting the Albuquerque metropolitan area and the Las Cruces metropolitan areas to recover earlier than elsewhere in the state. The rest of the state to recover sometime around 2024, Santa Fe to recover back to pre-pandemic levels sometime around 2026, Farmington and Leonard counties over the course of the forecast not expected to recover back to where we were prior to the pandemic. And so this is indexing back to those areas' employment levels in 2019. So we produced alternative scenarios. Again, I won't spend too much time here, but what we want to do is we want to have some idea of what the kind of reasonable bounds of what the economy might look like in New Mexico. This is the bounds that we have for New Mexico are informed in part by the forecast that we get from IHS, who I've talked about several times here, who also produce an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario, which we run through our model to see how that affects things. What I'll note is that their optimistic, baseline, and pessimistic scenarios aren't really substantially different. And so what we've done is we've produced an additional pessimistic scenario that's a little bit more like the trends that we saw after the Great Recession, and produces what we're calling, or what's called effectively, an L-shaped recovery, where we aren't returning to pre-pandemic levels by 2026. So back to IHS, as I mentioned, by 2022, in their kind of baseline scenario and in their optimistic scenario, they're expecting, if we index back to pre-pandemic jobs levels, that there will be a recovery in the number of jobs back to those pre-pandemic levels. Even in their pessimistic scenario, by 2023, early 2023, they're expecting that jobs levels will be recovered back to pre-pandemic levels. So even in their kind of worst case scenario, the recovery will be delayed by a quarter or two compared to the baseline. In New Mexico, as I've already mentioned, we're anticipating that by 2024, New Mexico will be back to pre-pandemic levels. In the baseline scenario, the optimistic scenario is almost no different, effectively the same quarter of 2024. The pessimistic scenario, basically a quarter later or 2 quarters after that, so mid 2024, we're expecting employment to be back to pre-pandemic levels. In order to kind of take into consideration our experience that we saw after the Great Recession and the fact that New Mexico is sort of failing to recover at a rate commensurate with other states, we produced this pessimistic 2 scenario. And this has a more sort of attenuated recovery than our already sort of attenuated recovery, such that even by 2026, we don't recover back to the number of jobs that we had in 2019. And so you see a slower rate of job gain from 2021 and out. And in fact, effectively, there's no gain in 2021 compared to the other scenarios. And in fact, there's actually some job loss in 2021, whereas in the other scenarios, we're seeing even a little bit of job gain in 2021 compared to 2020. And then somewhat faster rates of growth kind of in the immediate term thereafter compared to this pessimistic 2 scenario. So it will take some time under any of these cases for us to get back to where we were prior to the pandemic. But in that pessimistic 2 scenario, it probably, if you trended it out even further, would take till 2027 or maybe even 2028 to get back to where we were in 2019. And with that, that's what I have. And so if there's any other questions, I would be happy to respond.
Thank you, Mo. That looks great. And I don't see anything, but let's give them a minute to see if anybody has any additional questions. And I'm going to just share my screen for a minute and note that the next session will start at 3 o'clock. It'll be for labor market information, Rachel Moskowitz, Bureau Chief for Research and Economic Research for Chief Economic Research and Analysis for New Mexico Department of Workforce Solutions. Do we have any questions for Mo here? I don't see anything coming in, so I'm going to assume everybody has absorbed this and is not crying too hard at the moment. I think we did a good job keeping up with the questions there.
Should I stop the recording, Susan?
Yeah, I think you can stop the recording. And like I said, we'll pick back up here at 3. So everybody can take a little bit of a break.